Welcome. Thank you for being here. This is a recording giving an introduction to the Massachusetts Climate Change Assessment discussion of statewide climate impacts. Today, we're going to be covering the purpose of the climate assessment, how the Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs is undertaking the assessment, and the methodology underlying the assessment. And finally, we'll discuss the role of stakeholders and community voice in the process. The purpose of the climate assessment is to develop a fuller picture of climate impacts and how they affect communities. We will then look at those impacts and prioritize those that most need to be addressed in the update to the State Hazard Mitigation and Climate Adaptation Plan, which will be taking place in 2023. A key goal of this assessment is to understand who will be most affected and prioritize impacts that fall most heavily on environmental justice and socially vulnerable communities. So that's a significant component of the assessment and the analysis throughout. I'm going to turn it over to Jackie Wilworth from Industrial Economics to discuss some of these impacts on Massachusetts communities.
Thanks, Elizabeth. There are 5 key climate hazards we'll focus on today, and those are listed here. The first is heat, which includes both general warming as well as an increase in the number of extreme heat days. Flooding, which includes river flooding as well as backups in overwhelmed drainage systems. Droughts, storms and extreme weather, and sea level rise, which can result in both permanent flooding along the coast as well as increases in high tide flooding events. For example, areas that used to flood maybe once a year on a particularly high tide may flood more frequently under sea level rise. And these hazards can also occur at the same time, which can cause even larger problems. For example, a big storm on top of sea level rise can cause even more flooding and coastal damage, or a high heat event during a drought can, exacerbate those problems as well. So next we'll walk through each of these hazards and discuss some examples of the impacts caused by these hazards. So the first hazard we'll talk about is heat, and each of these slides is set up in this way where we'll list the hazard on the left-hand side. In the middle, we list some examples of the direct impacts of that hazard. And then on the right, we have some indirect impacts or other ways that these hazards kind of directly impact and indirectly impact your daily life. So I won't speak to all of the impacts on each of these slides, but I will highlight a few for each hazard. So for example, with heat, we know that higher temperatures can cause worse air quality and smog. Extreme temperatures can cause heat stroke and make things harder for people with certain chronic health conditions. And these and other health-related impacts can lead to higher medical care costs, missed work and school, either while sick or caring for someone who is sick, a generally lower quality of life dealing with illness, and in extreme cases, death. Heat has also been shown to cause increase in mental health effects, and higher temperatures also require higher energy costs for cooling. And finally, at the bottom, heat can lead to water shortages and also ecosystem stress and change in habitat, which can lead to lost fishing, hunting, recreation opportunities, as well as just loss of species and stress in the ecosystem, and also crop damage and loss. The next hazard that we'll discuss is flooding. So flooding, and this is particularly focused on inland flooding, not coastal flooding due to sea level rise, although there are some similarities in the impacts from both. Flooding causes damage to homes and structures, which can result in repair costs, higher insurance rates in the floodplain, business closures, both during a flooding event and during repair and cleanup, and also potentially pest and rodent issues following a flood. Moisture following flooding events can cause mold, especially if not cleaned up properly, and that can lead to respiratory health impacts. We have here toxins and sewer contamination. If certain sites that have these sort of materials are flooded, there can be high cleanup costs and also health concerns. And finally, road and transit closures. which can lead to a host of problems, including, again, missed work and school, medical care access issue, and other critical services, including emergency response delays if there are certain closures in the road that make it hard for people to get the help they need. Next, we have drought. Some of the impacts of drought include lower agricultural yields. And you'll see some of the highest production crops in Massachusetts: sweet corn, cranberries, apple, maple syrup. And these obviously contribute to food access and costs. And when we think about food access and costs, we can also think about the impacts to agriculture outside of Massachusetts, which might disrupt food system and food supply. There's the impacts to agriculture industry and revenues coming from these crops, and also the losses of income and livelihood, either directly to farmers and associated industries. Some of these listed, apples and maple syrup, for example, have a tourism component that would also be impacted. The other side of farming is also the local gardens and food autonomy, which could also be impacted by drought. There are impacts on recreation, again, water supply issues, and ecosystem stress. And here we've listed fisheries damage and also urban tree cover loss, which we know is particularly susceptible to drought and provides a lot of benefits, particularly in terms of cooling, which may become even more important as heating occurs. The next impact, or the next hazard, is storms and extreme weather. Again, we see buildings damaged from high winds and other related hazards. There's transportation closures and delays, both during the event and the cleanup, and electricity and utility disruption. And so some of the times this may last multiple days, as I'm sure people are familiar with. And all of these have some of the same indirect impacts we've discussed before: missing work, lost income, closed schools during storm events, isolation of vulnerable people who aren't able to get the supplies and visits they might need, or just social interaction that they're used to during these events, disrupted access to medical care, both in terms of ability to get to appointments or other needs, and if electricity is needed for certain medical devices, this can be a real problem. There's also state spending on response, in addition to individual spending, and again, business interruptions. And finally, we have the injury and loss of life that's a potential during these extreme events. The final hazard that we will talk about today is sea level rise. Again, we see the destruction and permanent flooding of coastal homes and structures, which can lead to a host of problems, including loss of tax dollars for communities who rely on the taxable property value on the coastal region. The communities that located in these areas will have to potentially relocate and are displaced, which causes stress and trauma for those communities, as well as potential impacts on the receiving communities further inland, including competition for undeveloped land, and also infrastructure stress if communities are built for small populations that grow more rapidly than planning had accounted for. There's flooded infrastructure and utilities. We have a lot of infrastructure built up along our coast, including things like wastewater treatment plants. So all of those may have to be rebuilt inland. There could be closures to certain industries on the coast, ports and marinas, for example. And again, the threat of hazardous material release. We have also, in terms of transportation, frequent road flooding during high tide events, sometimes called sunny day flooding. And this can lead to missed work in school, business interruptions, and travel delays, as well as evacuation route closures. During extreme events, when sea level rise kind of combine, that can be a problem for some coastal areas. Finally, we have coastal erosion and coastal wetland loss. There's a lot of important habitats along the coast that could be vulnerable to sea level rise. So we've just looked at the impacts organized by hazards, but you can also think about these by sector. And in this assessment, we're looking across the 5 sectors listed here: human health and welfare, infrastructure, governance, environment, and jobs and economy. And the sectors help us prioritize what to do in terms of adaptation eventually, and also, who might be responsible for addressing certain concerns. Obviously, these sectors overlap, and this is not an exact science, just as the hazards can interact, but this helps us kind of organize the impacts that we're seeing. So here we have an example using the sea level rise impacts we just looked at. We can classify each of these impacts by their sector. So here now we are highlighting the human health and welfare impacts. You can see the infrastructure, governance, environment, and finally jobs and economy. Another helpful way to think about impacts is by region. So obviously different hazards show up in different parts of the state in different ways. For example, we talked about, again, sea level rise. There's the direct impacts to coastal communities, but there are also indirect impacts to inland regions that should be accounted for, but thought about a little bit differently. It's also important to think by region, because while some adaptation actions may be statewide, we know there's also a lot of work being done by local and regional governments to address the impacts of climate change. So it's helpful for those groups to know where to focus specific to the concerns of their region. So we will be prioritizing the impacts we're learning about, both by sector that we just talked about and by region in this assessment. Another important consideration, as Elizabeth mentioned, is when we're thinking about where these impacts are felt, it's also important to know who will be bearing the brunt of these impacts across the state. And one way we do that is by using the Massachusetts Environmental Justice Viewer. And we can identify where populations with environmental justice or EJ concerns are located. And the state defines these areas based on the criteria shown here: median income, minority population, and English language proficiency. And these areas have been subject to a history of disproportionate environmental pollution and are more likely to be vulnerable to climate impacts going forward. For example, it may be more difficult for a household with lower income to install and run air conditioners or other cooling systems during a heat wave. Or communities with limited English language proficiency may not have access to the same resources to recover following an extreme event. And so in our framework, as we're identifying the most urgent risks of climate change, we are considering the disproportionality of those impacts in terms of who is most affected by each of these changes. Just to illustrate this point, we have an example here which shows the increase in childhood asthma diagnoses per 100,000 children. This is from a previous study by the Environmental Protection Agency. And you can see that even when we're controlling for population, there is an unequal distribution of where these new cases are projected to occur in this map. And when you compare that to a couple of other maps we show on the left here, you can see, there's some similarities with the patterns of the Environmental Justice Viewer, for example, which is a social vulnerability indicator. And there's also some overlap with this other map, which shows impervious surfaces, things like pavement and buildings, which add to the urban heat island effect. So geography and development also come into play here. So I think now I will turn it back to Elizabeth to give a little bit more detail on how we are conducting this assessment.
Thank you, Jackie. So I want to just walk you through the key phases that will be occurring in the assessment and what are the opportunities for community input at each one. What we have recently been working on and will be wrapping up soon is identifying impacts to communities and the common resources that we all rely upon. That's sort of the what. The second phase, upcoming in spring of 2022, looks at the where, how, and who, thinking about how to prioritize which impacts need the most attention, and again, importantly, determining who is most affected and where are those impacts being felt disproportionately. Third, the technical team will be developing draft findings saying, here's what our model is suggesting are those sort of highest priority impacts to address, share those with stakeholders, and refine those findings to finalize an assessment based on community input. And then finally, this assessment will become the sort of foundation that supports the update to the state hazard mitigation and climate adaptation plan. And I'll just describe those a little bit more here. So again, this first phase, the what, looks at identifying impacts to communities and resources. And in order to do that, we've been working to integrate the best available information, reviewing existing research from a number of sectors, and then very importantly, looking to incorporate community knowledge to uncover how climate impacts are affecting communities in ways that we may not be expecting or that may not be fully reflected in the research we've been able to assemble. So we'll be using community input, and we have been using community input to uncover and clarify those impacts and what is of most concern now and for the future. And then, as Jackie mentioned, we'll be taking all of that input on climate impacts and categorizing it by sector and by region in order to aid the analysis. In the second phase, we'll be focused on prioritizing and determining who is most affected. And so we'll be taking that sort of long list of climate impacts and elevating those by region and by sector that most need attention for future adaptation planning and action. And the primary criteria that we'll be using to do that ranking exercise will be these criteria. One is, how severe are the climate impacts? Are they large? Are they going to be affecting wide swaths of the population? Disproportionality, again, are the impacts or burdens from those impacts falling most heavily on socially vulnerable communities or those who are already facing environmental pollution or other burdens? And finally, adaptation gaps. Where has there not been enough funding or action in order to adapt, and where will additional attention really help? And you can see that's what this graph on the right side of the screen refers to. In cases where there are many benefits to adaptation and when there's not enough current planning and action, that's an indicator that we need to be putting more attention there. And then third, again, the technical team will develop draft findings and say, this is what the model suggests we need to be attending to most in that adaptation planning phase. And we'll be coming to communities and stakeholders and asking, what did we get right? What did we miss here? And what needs more explanation or emphasis to really fully understand the way that climate change is affecting communities? And based on that input, we will refine our findings and then finally share a revised draft, share a revised assessment with stakeholders and for use in the update to the state hazard mitigation and climate adaptation plan. Just a few words on next steps. More information can be found at this website, and we hope that communities and stakeholders attend the next phases in the spring and the summer. In May and June, again, we'll be focused on that second phase where we'll be looking to get community input to prioritize those impacts according to that criteria that I shared. What impacts are most severe? Where are they felt disproportionately? And where do we most need to focus our adaptation planning and action? And then in July and August, we'll have community review of the draft findings and get your help refining those and identifying gaps. In September, there will be a public comment period on the draft assessment. And then in October, that assessment will be finalized and will again serve as the foundation to the update of the state hazard mitigation and climate adaptation plan process. Thank you so much for joining. We hope this is a helpful introduction to the state climate assessment, and we look forward to your involvement.